So we want to get right into the discussion, and I'm glad all of you are here with us. Let's see, Steve and Federico, research shows that all students benefit from learning about a wide variety of perspectives and figures, and students from oppressed groups in particular benefit from seeing themselves represented in their classes. For educators who are interested in making their lessons more inclusive but don't know where to start, do you have any recommended resources, favorite authors, important but traditionally overlooked historical or cultural figures?
Okay, thank you, and thank you for inviting me. As always, the webinars that you put together are just magnificent. The resources are so good. The panelists are a pleasure to listen to and to learn from. So thank you for inviting me once again. The first thing that I will say, amazing to be in the same panel with people from Teaching Tolerance. If you ask me my favorite authors, I will say, I don't have a favorite author, I have a favorite resource, and that is going to Teaching Tolerance. I have gone to Teaching Tolerance for over 20 years for many of my workshops, and I will say, as I speak to all of you, I have not been in the classroom except for here and there a few semesters. For over 25 years, I've been working with teachers. I train teachers, that's what I do. So typically when I talk about students, I'm talking about their students, not mine. Not necessarily famous, one of the questions is traditionally overlooked important people. And I will tell you a little bit about how I go about it. It is who is important to their culture, not necessarily mine. When I was a student, and as you said, I am an immigrant myself, and I was faced with the literary canon. You must learn this information, this literature. You must learn this author. My reaction was always, why? Why are we not listening to the authors or reading the authors of my culture? And our students have the same experience. Is there is a culture that is being ignored when we are forcing them to, for example, to study Shakespeare, but I wanted to read more of Cervantes. And I wanted my American colleagues and friends to read Cervantes. That is not part of the American canon. Something that I want everybody to learn, because it will come up again and again, is culturally responsive teaching. If you're not familiar with CRT, please become familiar. I do have resources to share, but there is no time for that right now. And finally, I would like to tell you, everybody, there are two resources that I like a lot, and there are a number of editions. Mine is kind of old. That is called Readings for Diversity and Social Justice, and the companion book, Teaching for Diversity and Social Justice, both edited by Maurianne Adams and published by Routledge, with CD-ROMs, with additional activities. Well, now the activities are online.
CD-ROMs, what? Steve.
Yes.
And Julie as well, what do you have to add to that?
Well, first of all, I absolutely love what Federico had to say about including Cervantes in the curriculum alongside Shakespeare. I think that's a wonderful, wonderful approach. I think we also need, you know, here's one of the reasons I love teaching tolerance, and thank you so much, Julie and Amy, for your great, every time I get so excited when teaching tolerance, when I get my, I have to say, I'm a little prejudiced about the hard copy, but that's just because I'm old. So, you know, I just love having that magazine in hand. I do love it online too, I'm not gonna lie. But I think we're living in such an exciting time right now to be a teacher, and especially when you're teaching a diverse population. I'm just like right now, there's so many things, and I have like a wealth of authors that I'd love to touch base and mention at some point. I think we were talking about that, but just for one brief example, take the recent streaming of Lin-Manuel Miranda's musical Hamilton. That's a pivotal historic moment in time. The fact that this has happened, because it indicates that the story is no, and if you just like zoom back for a second and look at the whole picture, we have the history book by Ron Chernow, which is a source that Lin-Manuel just dives into and makes his own, and he tells the story in a contemporary idiom, and it makes it clear that it's not just white people's story to tell. The fact that he can tell the story in a way that is sympathetic with the founding fathers, 75% of whom were slaveholders, and he can find common ground. Well, with somebody like Hamilton, who was an abolitionist and raised in the West Indies, so I think that we're starting to see a reassessment or a reevaluation of traditional curricula that doesn't necessarily respect the old white boundaries. And I think that this is crucial. I think it's like absolutely critical to the future of our country. So you had asked about resources. Any recommended resources? Well, I have, once again, guess which one was number one? Teaching Tolerance. I didn't even have to say it. Facing History and Ourselves. I have To Kill a Mockingbird is still part of our curriculum. I don't know if you can see this, but this is their book, Teaching Mockingbird. It's a full-length curriculum on teaching Mockingbird that brings in diverse voices. Interestingly enough, even the College Board has felt pressure to sort of adapt their, really bring in some progressive voices. So when they're teaching about the value of a college education, they include, diverse perspectives from authors like William Rodriguez, who writes, a memoir and a poem about a childhood incident he had an encounter with racism. That is really quite a fascinating comparison, that they do a side-by-side comparison of the same story told through two different genres. So it's magnificent. Other authors that I like to include. First of all, I think including poetry is really a great way to go, because you can do so much with just a few, like every single student, no matter what culture they come from, has a poetic tradition. And this is a case where Google can be their friend. They can find, even if they're not familiar, they may be able to speak to a relative. Have you read poetry? Who's your favorite poet from our tradition? And sometimes, like within certain traditions, you might find, like overlapping historical layers that might tell, like for instance, I was doing a little research not that long ago on Salvadoran poetry, and saw that there was a colonial period, there was a response to the colonial period, there was a populist authoritarian period. So these are things that students can actually, dig deep into and find out things about their culture that maybe they hadn't known, and share it with a broader culture. Other resources I have, like a poet like, this is so hard to move in the right direction, Pablo Neruda. This is just one of his books that I have, and it's full of lots of poetry. For a more advanced student, I would use somebody like Jorge Luis Borges. Some of his short stories and ficciones, really good.
Well, Steve, how about we compile these into a list and send them out?
I would be happy to do that. I can put that up.
Julian, Amy, I wanted to ask you all about some of your resources that you spoke about earlier, but also give us some strategies and examples of how you've incorporated the immigrant voice in various aspects of the classroom and the curriculum, and how do you make it a part of everyday teaching and learning?
Julie, I'll have you go first and share a resource, and then I'm going to talk about a strategy.
So I was just going to re-emphasize that one we already showed. I've got my little post-it notes here because I use this. This is a great one to distribute at professional learning environments. Copies can be downloaded PDF in our Teaching Tolerance website, but it's great because it does reference that culturally relevant teaching that people have been talking about. And it's just a nice, concise way for people that aren't necessarily English language teachers to get a general overview of what's important to keep in mind when working with these students and their families. Take it away, Amy.
All right. So I'm reflecting on your question about examples and strategies about incorporating the immigrant voice, and I don't have a strategy. I don't know if there is a strategy. I think of it more as a lens through which I look through everything that a student would touch or read or see. Okay, so I'll explain that a little bit. Hallways and classroom presentation visuals, anything that they would see, are they representative of your student population? If not, you need to change it. What about articles, books, texts, anything that they're reading? Are they diverse authors? Can your students see themselves in that reading? If not, change it. And then one example I have is something that I'm in the process of doing right now. I co-teach a US history class. So let's talk about a time, if there ever was a time to be teaching and co-teaching a US history class, this is it right now. And so what we're doing for next year is we're adding a book club right after our civil rights unit. Okay, and we're saying it's a human rights book club. All right, and so our essential question, which I'm just obsessed with and I love, who gets to tell the story? Who gets to tell the story? And then our books that we're in the middle of finalizing, but the themes are, we have books about identities that are queer, indigenous, feminist, and Black. And then our, in subsequent years, and then currently, definitely for next year, we're going to focus on having one of the activities be the Emma Lazarus's New Colossus poem. And we're going to have students rewrite the poem from the perspective of the book that they're reading. And what does that mean to the author of their book or to the experience that they're reading in their book? So that's what I would have to say about that.
I think Ken Cuccinelli rewrote the Emma Lazarus poem, but that aside, Federico, in the adult setting, what do you have to add?
Well, I don't have much to add really in terms of the adult setting. And I will say something what I forget, Amy just said about the lens is very important. It is more important than one particular strategy. Why? Because if you teach in K through 12, the strategies that work for you will not necessarily work for adults and vice versa. But what I will say, and by the way, Steve, you mentioned both Neruda and Borges, and I did not want to bring it up early when I talked about the canon and who determines that we need to teach, I don't know, Shakespeare, but not Cervantes. I was also thinking about Latin American literature. My father is a Latin American writer, and Neruda was one of his friends, and he has written about Borges. So actually, Latin American literature was in my mind more so than Cervantes. So that's funny. What I would say is in adult education, once again, become familiar with culturally responsive training and let or generate stories from the students. If the students are willing and able and feel safe to tell their own stories, then those stories can be, as Michael said earlier, springboards for a much richer conversation in whatever you are teaching. I know that there is another question coming later about that, but the stories can be used to teach in practically every topic that you are teaching, and we will talk about that later.
And we're hearing a lot of literature, but there are other subject areas, and we do have attendees who teach science, they teach other things. So Julie and Federico, perhaps even Steve, how do you bring immigration into math and science?
So yeah, I'm thinking back to this culturally responsive teaching strategies. There is a excellent book from Corwin Publishers by Zaretta Hammond. It's the Culturally Responsive Teaching in the Brain. And she has really, she's broken it down into 4 strategies that are geared to any subject area, but I think with this question, thinking about science and math, the 2 areas that we don't typically think of with language, she breaks it down into first ignite. So it's something to capture attention, maybe a call and response, maybe some music, maybe some brief discussion to ease into a topic. Then she says chunk the material into digestible pieces. We often think of secondary educators standing in front of a class and talking on and on. So we need to break it down into smaller chunks of information that they can connect to their current funds of knowledge. And then her third step, she says, is chew, give the brain time to break this material down. And she has a fact, she says the brain takes in information for 12 to 20 minutes, but then it needs a 5 to 10 minute break to process what it took in. So I thought that was interesting to keep in mind. And the last, she says review. So don't then throw out more information, find a way to incorporate that current information into a real life type problem, especially in math. I think you could do the science too, and tie it into a long-term project. But good things to keep in mind, I think, for those other subject areas that aren't language arts.
I'm going to hear in the feedback survey. I'm going to hear in the feedback survey about that need for 5 to 10 minutes to absorb the information from all of our attendees today. Steve and Federico.
Well, let me say, Julie just mentioned one of the resources that I was going to share with you, and I didn't have the time, the book about the brain, CRT and the brain. I would also say, and I will give you an example, we can teach science, and when we teach science, the example is, if you're going to teach about natural phenomenon, in Houston, where I live, then the phenomenon that we need to teach about is hurricanes. In the Midwest is tornadoes. But don't bring up a tornado or a hurricane without referring to the experience, the lived experience of your students, which may be, for example, a cyclone. If they live in Southeast Asia, they may have even a story of surviving the tsunami 15 years ago, but they will not relate to a tornado in Kansas. So make it real for them. You can still teach the same unit about weather and about natural phenomenon and how to react to them or how to prepare, but respecting their lived experience by asking them, well, you know, when I was born, a hurricane is a problem, but what about in your land? And that is very easy. It's the same lesson, but just respecting their lived experience and their perspective.
That's particularly important for 9th grade, since in New York, at least, the science, the default science course in 9th grade is earth science. So that would be a really great way. And also it fits in with with my approach in the classroom of, I know it's not just mine, but you know, my approach of actually trying to center the student's experience. And if you can do that, that's a really great thing to do. And you can do that regardless of wherever you're coming from. I can't really speak too much about math and science. It's an area I would have to, you know, look into further to find good resources. But, you know, when we're talking about history, for example, you know, you can talk about Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta and the 1965 United Farm Workers strike. And basically, and this also fits in with what you were saying before about, you know, understanding by design to shape your curriculum and lessons, is like whatever unit you happen to be teaching, you can teach, you know, if there's a historical event, let's say one of the things that has been coming out this year, you know, the Tulsa massacre, of this destroying of the Greenwood neighborhood. You know, there are resources that are available for that. There are young adult novels that tell like both sides of stories. A great one that I've read, and the author's name escapes me, but it's on my bookshelf. I'm not gonna run back and get it. But there's a novel called Dreamland Burning that tells this story, sort of a parallel narrative about the Tulsa massacre. and the destruction of that town. So there's lots of other sources. There's a novel, a great novel if you have indigenous students, about that I just read called Hearts Unbroken, and it's about a school play, a school who the school has they're putting on a production of The Wizard of Oz, and one of the things that comes out in the novel that I hadn't been familiar with myself was that apparently L. Frank Baum, who wrote the Wizard of Oz books, was a rabid anti-indigenous individual. So, you know, all of those things are really good possibilities. There's lots out there, and when I put out my list, I'll make sure to put those novels on there. I included them in my student summer reading list for this particular summer. I started it last summer.
And I would mention that in the chat box, the teachers are putting your guys to shame, because they are putting out tons of names and book titles and Facebook groups and other things. So please, and yes, we learned this many years ago that we need to save the chat and compile all those resources that people have shared.
Absolutely.
So we do that.
Absolutely. In fact, if I may say something, I was looking at the chat, and somebody, I think her name is Hope, mentioned Chimamanda Adichie's and her work. And Chimamanda talks about the danger of a single story. And what we are talking about here, if we're going to respect the stories of our students and bring them out and teach using those stories, centering our teaching around those the immigrants that we have in the classrooms, we need to listen to the danger of a single story. I think Amy earlier, or maybe it was Julie, talked about who tells the story, who gets to tell the story. Well, not only who gets to tell the story, who owns the master narrative that we operate in, and then what is the danger of only listening to one single story, both about America, but also about our students, our immigrants in our classrooms. So thank you, Hope, for bringing that up.
I'm very glad that she did. And you talk about danger, and I think it's Jacqueline and Jacqueline in the chat box, have concerns about bringing up immigration in the classroom in today's climate. How can teachers really safely do that? And how do we not alienate maybe US-born students in that conversation? And I think I want to ask this to Amy and Steve.
Yeah, so the question is, how do you bring up immigrant voices in the classroom? You just do. You just do, because it's who we are as a nation. We are a nation of immigrants. And so I think about often people are scared, or there is fear to bring up ideas of immigration or immigration stories. And I equip my students, and I am very well versed in the Speak Up at School strategies that we presented on yesterday. So honestly, I don't have faculty, I don't have administration that messes with me or my students, because I constantly call them in on conversations. Someone says something that I think is biased, we have a conversation about it. So either they know, like, oh, I'm not going to ask that, or I'm not going to say that because I know she's going to talk to me about it. I know we're going to continue a conversation. Or they are perhaps educated in why it's important to bring immigrant voices into the classroom. And so I use those strategies with my students. And so I honestly rarely have issues with my students either, because they are very well versed in the strategies and they can address issues. They don't have to come to me with them. So I think about that concept. And then I also think about, it's all about how we center those voices. And so as an ELL educator, I focus on student assets. So what can they do, right? Versus the student deficit, what can't they do? As long as we focus on the student assets, that really starts the stage and really sets the stage on what students have to offer to the classroom. And then it makes our students feel more willing to have those conversations about their personal identities.
Yes, I agree. Unpacking a student's personal identity, it comes from starting with where they are. There's a project I like to begin the year with. If you're familiar with word webs, you might be familiar with the concept of the identity web. You know, you start with a circle in the middle that has your name in it, and you attach any associations you have, anything you're willing to share. Now, students can share as much or as little as they do, but this is an ongoing exercise that doesn't just take place once. We revisit it from time to time throughout the year, and it also enables the students to learn a great graphic organizer that they can then use to develop a character's identity in a novel, or you know, a speaker's identity in a short poem, or you know, the important facts about a historical figure. But if we start out, I start, you know, with, you know, Steve in the middle. You know, what am I? I'm a middle-aged white cis het, you know, all kinds of different, you know, every aspect, left-handed person, and all these different identities. You know, you can start out with like seemingly innocuous ones, like being left-handed, for example, and you can work that into the conversation. Then possibly, maybe you can get a little bit, you know, a little bit more brave and put, you know, your sexual identity or your gender identity, and things like that can actually. Some students are not going to be comfortable sharing that, but at the same time, if you open the door, like if you look at my name, you know, I put my pronouns on. You know, I do that all the time, even though, you know, my pronouns are probably what most people would assume. But that opens the door for other people. Somebody asked a question before about my affiliation with the Association for White Anti-Racist Educators. The reason we did that, it was not so much to create a uniquely white space, but to acknowledge that white people have a certain specific work to do around anti-racism that our Black and brown and indigenous brothers and sisters and beloveds do not have. And that is sometimes it's to just shut up and listen. It's to learn, you know, it's to not center. It's to not make ourselves the center of the conversation. And that's one of the things I encourage. If you're interested, come visit the Facebook group. It's like as Denzil pointed out, we after the death of George Floyd, we quadrupled in size. We're now up to, as of this morning, I believe we were up to 2,600. The reason I got involved in this, I was involved in I was a moderator for a national organization around education that had problems around race issues. There was a lot of tone policing going on in the conversation, and some of us moderators really objected to it and called people on it. And because of that, the executive board decided we were over-modding, and so we formed our own place. We built our own clubhouse. So
well, speaking of problematic people, we have some teachers who are concerned about, directed at you, Amy, Lois and Rebecca, wondering about parents being concerned about what you're teaching in the classroom. If you're speaking up so boldly about immigrants and you're saying that Nation of Immigrants is some sort of fact, there are people who might object to that. How do you deal with that, or how do you respond to it?
I can talk a little bit about that. So I work in an affluent area in and around the city of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And so we sometimes have parents that are concerned about the content that we teach. And so we initially send out a letter stating that we will be looking at various identities. And if you have concerns, or if you have, religious beliefs that allow for something to be avoided or not talked about, please have a conversation with us. We do a ton of book clubs. So instead of a read aloud, we would go ahead and read or have, 6 different options. So if this one option that your family does not believe in or agree with, you have 5 other options to choose from. And then I have other educators that just are consistently like talking to their parents and sharing what's going on in the classroom. It's really important to have parents as your advocates at home and your collaborators and your team members. They will continue a conversation at home that you can't have because you're not inside that home. And so the more we can have that trusting relationship with them, the better and the further we'll go in our classrooms.
Anyone want to add anything to that?
Well, I would add one thing. I read something about how do you deal with those anti-immigrant parents. And I would suggest, and I work with adult education, but also in the K-12 arena, I would suggest stay away from the politics of immigration and focus, if you're going to be successful in the classroom, bringing up those voices, focus on the contributions, both of the individual and of the community to all of us, so that it's not about whatever laws we are discussing in Congress today or not discussing, as the case may be, but rather what are the contributions that we can all benefit from. And most parents, even anti-immigrant parents, know someone that they respect or have heard of somebody's contribution to our economy, to our culture, that they can live with. So focus on those contributions rather than on the politics of immigration.
And we have a great question from Ruth about that very Nation of Immigrants statement. I don't know if Adam is still on, if he could join us for a minute. Otherwise, I'm going to ask each of you, we have Federico coming up to give us some brand new research. So I wanted to thank each of you for this really, really great conversation. I think you gave a lot of ideas, and you also elicited a lot of ideas from our participants themselves. So we have a lot to compile. But perhaps in 10 seconds, if each of you can give your one top tip to educators as to what they can do now to center the immigrant voice, what would that be? And maybe we start with you, Julie.
Sure. My number 1 tip would be getting to know your students and your families as much as they're willing to share with you, and creating that relationship, making that family connection is going to be critical.
Steve?
I would say that no matter what teaching technique you use to bring in your students, respect boundaries. You may have cultural issues that are very important that you're bringing into the discussion, and it may take time for students to be comfortable to share. On their identity web, for example, as I mentioned before, I might be comfortable putting my pronouns, they might not. And that could be particularly true if they have intersectionalities. But once again, I want to thank you so much for the opportunity to participate in this panel. I personally have learned so much from being here today, and I feel like I've gotten to meet a few really wonderful resources, particularly Federico. I'd like to continue our conversation.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Amy?
So Julie talked a little bit about getting to know your students and your families. That's really important, and do that right away within the first few weeks that you meet them. And then after you know your students and your families, take a 30,000-foot view of everything that they are touching and seeing and reading and everything. If they don't see themselves, then you need to change that and continually change. Don't ever stop changing, because your students will also never stop changing. That's my advice.
Federico?
Okay, number 1, build a community of respect inside the classroom. So before you bring out the stories of immigration, get them to respect each other. And there are techniques to teach how to build that respect. In fact, I teach workshops on that, building a community of respect. But one that is very important, and I have not heard anyone mention, at least today, it's critical do not assume, please don't do it. And most of you listening to this workshop will not do this because otherwise you would not be here. I know that I'm preaching to the choir, but don't assume that any particular immigrant or any minority that you have in your classroom can speak for the whole group. I'll give you an example. I have listened to people say, turn to someone and say, oh, Mary, you're black. What do blacks think about X? I have been asked to represent Chicanos. I'm not Chicano. How can I represent the experience of a Chicano? I was born and raised in Argentina. I am not Chicano. So, but I have been asked to because I have a Hispanic last name. So please do not assume that and don't put them in the spot of if they are the only person representing that group in your classroom. Please don't do that.
Federico, that was more than 10 seconds. That's going to cut into your time.
I know.
Adam, I wanted to bring you back on looking at that very same thing you're talking about, looking at minorities and how they're represented. Ruth wants to know, how can we rephrase the "we are a nation of immigrants" from the reimagining migration perspective to be inclusive of groups like African Americans and Native Americans?
Absolutely.
Any thoughts on that before?
Yeah, absolutely. We are not a nation. Well, how do I say this gently? We are a nation that has a lot of wonderful contributions from immigrants, but we are not a nation of immigrants. It's part of the history that I started to share this morning, right? We are a nation of migrants by force or by choice, right? Actually, migration becomes a through line of human history. Steve is talking about, settler colonialism. It's absolutely part of a migration story. It's one of many migration stories, right? The great migration of African Americans, of 6 million African Americans that go to the North after World War I until 1970. These are continuums of the migration story. What they do is they provide, there's some similarities, and there's incredible important differences in these conversations. So I talk about ourselves as a nation of migrants, and let's talk and get to know the differences.